Part 1. The bronze doors of the Apostolic Palace closed after the last general audience, and for an instant, that seemed to stop time, the hollow echo of the bolt traveled through Bernini's colonnade. In that unusual silence, the most veteran Vatican observers understood that something extraordinary was underway. Along the Via della Conciliazione, journalists and pilgrims caught contradictory signals. Some officials assured that Pope Leo would simply take a few days of rest, while others with a worried look limited themselves to dodging questions. The official bulletins spoke of personal retreat for prayer and reflection, but a phrase added, "at the last minute, place and duration reserved," lit the fuse of worldwide speculation. The white plane of Vatican City-State took off under a fine drizzle with no publicly announced destination. Civilian radars detected a flight plan toward an Italian military airbase, then a transfer with unknown destination. That same night, air traffic monitors showed an unmarked jet heading across the Atlantic, only to disappear from commercial satellite range. The Holy See remained silent. The rumor machinery came to life with a force that not even the press office staff could contain. There was talk of exhaustion, a crisis of faith, geopolitical pressures, and even a possible post-viral syndrome that forced the pontiff to seek more benign climates. Meanwhile, in the corridors of the Secretariat of State, diplomats faced a storm of calls from Latin American embassies. Among whispers, the hypothesis emerged that Pope Leo intended to retreat to a remote Benedictine monastery in the Mexican Sierra, a place without media coverage, where 3 previous popes had entrusted private retreats. That abbey, founded in the 17th century, guarded archives on little-known Marian apparitions, and according to some prelates, a medical codex from the viceroyalty that preserved herbal recipes for the heart. The most prudent cardinals feared that the trip would be interpreted as a political preference toward the American continent, just when the Synod on Synodality was approaching its decisive phase. In Mexico City, night newsrooms improvised analysis tables. Analysts wondered if that retreat responded to internal pressures for financial reforms or to the recent wave of accelerated secularization in Europe. From Buenos Aires, old companions of Leo recalled his youthful fondness for the silences of the Puna and his respect for popular devotions of the Altiplano. A columnist noted that unlike his predecessors, the Pope had left detailed instructions. For the Curia, each prefect should send a daily report, summarized in 30 lines, without annexes, to avoid bureaucracy. That detail suggested that the pontiff's mind would remain attentive even as his body rested. On a dusty ranch in Coahuila, a foreman claimed to have seen vehicles with Italian diplomatic plates traveling at dawn toward the mountainous border. A local reporter spread the story, and within minutes, social networks made viral blurry images of a white silhouette getting into an SUV escorted by Mexican gendarmerie. Verification algorithms failed to confirm authenticity, but collective imagination had already woven a cinematic narrative. The spiritual leader of 1,200 million Catholics was leaving Rome to immerse himself in the desert in search of a revelation that would change the Church's course. That same afternoon, the Vatican's interim spokesman, Monsignor Bianchi, held a telematic press conference. With serene countenance, he assured that Pope Leo was in excellent health and that he would take advantage of the retreat to deepen the ecological encyclical he has been preparing for months. However, journalists detected hesitation when citing the location. Bianchi limited himself to thanking the expressions of affection and asked for respect for the Holy Father's privacy. Upon hanging up the call, Rome correspondents commented among themselves that rather than calming, those words had fueled the mystery. In parallel, certain Curia offices began receiving anonymous envelopes with photocopies of a real estate contract signed on behalf of a pontifical institute. The document indicated the purchase of an old astronomical observatory in the Peruvian Amazon, reconfigured as a center for studies on cosmology and indigenous spirituality. The main negotiator, according to the papers, would have been a close disciple of Leo. However, the agreement date went back 3 weeks before the Pope announced his retreat, indicating longer and more meticulous planning than suspected. Vatican history experts evoked precedents, Pius XI retiring to Castel Gandolfo before announcing the encyclical Non abbiamo bisogno, John XIV spending days in Lopiano before Vatican Council II. Every time a pope withdrew unexpectedly, a document emerged destined to shake consciences. Far from the spotlight inside Merida Airport, 2 cardinals, one Spanish and one Brazilian, were seen conversing with immigration officials, managing safe conducts for a reduced entourage. Among them was Sister Magdalena, a theologian specialized in Eastern patristics, whose research on the spirituality of the Desert Fathers had inspired Leo in several speeches. The religious woman's presence fed the theory of a contemplative retreat in the Mayan jungles, where almost unknown eremitic communities subsist. The night closed with news leaked to the ANSA agency. The Pope would have requested copies of the personal diaries of an old Franciscan missionary who described luminous phenomena in Chiapas caves. That detail, apparently minor, generated a spike in internet searches for sacred light and indigenous apparitions. For some, the request confirmed that the pontiff sought to confront mystical visions outside European tradition. For others, it was simply the pastime of a tired scholar. 3 days later, Mexican federal police reinforced controls on a stretch of the Sierra Madre Oriental, declaring it a temporary ecological preservation zone. International chains interpreted the measure as an almost definitive indication. However, a Sao Paulo correspondent divulged another clue: a secure order from the Swiss Guard reserves places in a Carmelite convent on the outskirts of Bogota, famous for its absolute silence retreats. No version could be confirmed. In his Roman apartment, a Cardinal Emeritus limited himself to saying off the record, "Wherever he is, Leo is rewriting the role of the papacy in the 21st century, and he knows it." For the first time in decades, St. Peter's Square felt orphaned. Pigeons fluttered without the usual faithful. The obelisk seemed to guard a secret that no one could decipher. Some nuns prayed the rosary, asking for the Pope's health. Bewildered tourists asked why the pontifical flag was at half-mast. The prefect of the pontifical house dispatched urgent matters with encrypted messages and hand deliveries to avoid leaks. The Swiss Guard music band rehearsed solemn marches, as if expecting a transcendental announcement. In academic circles, Latin American theologians debated the concept of prophetic vacations, a time apart that transcends simple physical recovery to become a performative act of spiritual leadership. They cited biblical prophets retreating to the desert and founding saints seeking caves and mountains before initiating radical reforms. According to them, Pope Leo would be, perhaps without saying so, emulating those foundational gestures to signal that the Church must rediscover its perennial root by moving away from digital noise and political tensions. In a Lima radio studio, a historian recalled that chroniclers of the Indies described similar retreats by the Incas. Before making state decisions, they isolated themselves in elevated sanctuaries, believing that height facilitated communion with the divine. The comparison was provocative, but served to illustrate how American cultures had integrated retreat as an act of authority. If Pope Leo now adopted that practice, it could imply a symbolic return of European Catholicism to the spiritual source of the New World. Part 2. The press office tried to extinguish the fire with an aseptic communiqué. The Holy Father thanks the prayer of the faithful and hopes to meet with them again soon. However, the final phrase, "Providence guides every step," seemed written to fuel intrigue. Catholic bloggers, geopolitical analysis channels, and conspiracy theorists agreed on one thing: nothing happened by chance. The Pope's absence in the middle of the boreal summer, when he traditionally dispatches from Castel Gandolfo, was at minimum a break from secular protocol. Meanwhile, in the Roman dawn, an anonymous email arrived to several Vaticanists with a blurry photograph. It showed a man in white praying on his knees before a tomb carved in rock, illuminated by artisanal candles. The sender did not indicate place or date, but a pre-Columbian fresco could be seen behind the tombstone. Digital forensics experts divided opinions, although the timing and symbolism were irresistible. If the image was authentic, it implied that the Pope had reached a sacred corner where indigenous roots and Christian faith converged, an act of historical reconciliation, live and in silence. Hours later, information inflation reached saturation levels. Editorials clamored for transparency. Diplomats protested the lack of coordination, and Italian stock markets registered slight oscillations before the power vacuum in the Holy See. However, in the Vatican gardens, gardeners continued their work, convinced that the Pope will return when God disposes, as Giuseppe, the caretaker of the pontifical roses, assured when approached by a Spanish network. That phrase, simple and subject to ancestral faith, contrasted with the frantic search for GPS satellite photos and leaks. The uncertainty surrounding Pope Leo's whereabouts not only fed conspiracy theories, but also provoked a profound internal debate in the Church. The cardinals closest to the pontiff met in private sessions, evaluating the implications of such a prolonged and enigmatic retreat. Some perceived in that pause an opportunity for the Pope to reflect on necessary reforms, while others feared that the absence would weaken pontifical authority at a critical moment. In Latin American Catholic communities, news of the retreat was received with a mixture of hope and concern. Parish priests and lay people organized vigils, outdoor masses, and candlelight processions, praying for the Holy Father's spiritual and physical health. On social networks, hashtags #prayer for the Pope and #Pope Leo retreat became trending, reflecting the effective connection that millions maintained with their spiritual leader. Meanwhile, religious geopolitics analysts studied the possible impact of the temporary absence on the Vatican's international relations. The Holy See, famous for its silent but effective diplomacy, faced a visible leadership vacuum. Governments with strong Catholic tradition observed cautiously, anticipating shifts in Vatican policy on migration, environment, and human rights. In Rome, daily life proceeded with apparent normalcy, but beneath the surface, latent tension was perceived. Vatican employees worked with unusual discretion, aware that any leak could unleash a media storm. Access controls were reinforced, and Swiss Guard members received strict instructions. The Pope's privacy must be preserved at all costs. The mystery also reached the academic community. Historians, theologians, and anthropologists dusted off maps and files from the secret archive in search of routes that ancient missionaries described as paths of penance. Some suggested that Leo was following the steps of saints who isolated themselves to achieve greater mystical clarity. Others interpreted the withdrawal as a theological act in itself, destined to underscore the urgency of contemplation in a world saturated with information. The international press redoubled efforts to locate the pontiff. Correspondents moved to monasteries of the Bolivian Altiplano, to villages in the Lacandon jungle, and to Aegean islands that, according to old chronicles, had welcomed traveling popes. However, the Holy See maintained iron silence. Each official silence became fuel for new conjectures. Sister Magdalena, the theologian accompanying the Pope, gained involuntary prominence. Her studies on the mysticism of the Desert Fathers and her experience in eremitic retreats reinforced the theory of a contemplative retreat with academic dimension. Rumors indicated that she conducted daily colloquiums with Leo, centered on the notion of sacred time and the need to rethink authority as service. A few weeks later, discreet leaks revealed the existence of an encyclical draft centered on integral ecology and social justice. The document, presumably in the Pope's hands during his retreat, contained passages destined to relaunch doctrine on creation as a non-negotiable gift and to demand global co-responsibility in the face of environmental devastation. Experts pointed to a high moral caliber text capable of shaking both markets and multilateral climate politics. Worldwide expectation grew at the rhythm of uncertainty. Each day without news increased pressure on the Holy See to offer concrete data. However, the strategy of cultivating enigma seemed calculated. Silence functioned as a mirror, forcing public opinion to question the true meaning of spiritual authority and the urgency of ecological conversion. In a small mining town in the Peruvian Sierra, a parish priest claimed to have seen a man dressed in white praying before a cross, carved in Quechua. Although the photo was blurry, the version was reproduced by local channels and multiplied on networks. Ecclesiastical officials neither confirmed nor denied. Ambiguity fed some people's faith and others' skepticism. During the second half of the retreat, diffuse signals arrived about the Pope's health. Medical sources from Gemelli Clinic declared off the record that no file had been requested, which indicated good physical condition. In contrast, a Filipino bishop commented to a European newspaper that Leo had traveled with a small team of cardiologists. Both versions coexisted without the Vatican issuing clarification. Meanwhile, inside the supposed retreat location, an ancient monastery nestled in mountains, only accessible by mules. Routine followed a monastic rhythm. The Pope slept in an austere cell, attended the Liturgy of Hours with local friars, and spent long afternoons reviewing documents on indigenous solidarity economies. The prior, a man of Zapotec origin, avoided pronouncing the word vacation. He spoke of examination of the world's conscience. In private conversations, the pontiff reflected on the fragility of the common home and the temptation of power in the digital age. He pointed out that excess visibility threatened the core of the Petrine ministry, based on silent service. He also meditated on passages from Isaiah about the voice crying in the wilderness, and interwove them with current testimonies of Amazonian peoples whose languages risk extinction. In Rome, a group of cardinals convened extraordinary meetings concerned about indefinitely prolonging the status quo. Some canonical jurists suggested declaring temporary impediment if the absence continued, which would allow naming an apostolic administrator. The majority discarded the idea for fear of a media schism. In the end, they drafted a collective letter requesting minimal information, health status, estimated duration, and return horizon. No one dared send it without everyone present's signature. International politics also began to resent the lack of papal gestures. At the UN, diplomats from island nations requested the Pope's moral intervention before stalled climate negotiations. Without his voice, official communiques lost symbolic reach. Simultaneously, ambassadors from countries in conflict wrote verbal notes asking if pontifical mediators maintained authority to dialogue on their behalf. One Roman dawn Vatican computer servers suffered a coordinated attack. Hackers demanded revelations about Leo's location and leaked private emails from minor prelates. Vatican gendarmerie neutralized the intrusion, But the incident elevated the sense of vulnerability. Experts pointed to radical groups opposed to financial reform, though without conclusive evidence. 2 days later, the press office released a brief handwritten message from the Pope. "Trust in Providence. I will return when discernment is complete." The text, released in 5 languages, bore the signature Leo PP. It included no date or location, but firm handwriting was noted. For graphological analysts, the straight line of strokes denoted determination. For the faithful, it was a balm confirming his good condition. The message fueled theories of all kinds. News agencies sent drones to remote regions, searching for colonial constructions, coinciding with the stone wall seen behind the letter during filming of the scan. A Brazilian media claimed to have identified the watermark of a 16th century convent in Goiás. The next day, a Polish newspaper related the paper to artisanal workshops in Tlaxcala. No one achieved definitive proof. Inside the retreat, the study day advanced. Sister Magdalena presented the Pope with a forgotten volume by Bernardino de Sahagún on reciprocity with the earth in Mesoamerican cultures. Leo underlined passages referring to kinship between species and commented that the concept could dialogue with the encyclical Laudato Si. Later, he received a small group of local farmers who shared native seeds as a sign of biocultural resistance. The scene was later described by a witness friar. He listened more than he spoke, and in his silence there was deep respect for every voice. That testimony leaked to the press and generated headlines about a pope determined to place agroecology at the center of social doctrine. Agro-industrial corporations issued communiques defending biotechnology, anticipating a barely announced global debate. Part 3. In the 6th week, the Holy See confirmed that the pontiff would preside over the next Angelus from a retreat location via remote transmission. The news provoked relief and expectation. On the designated Sunday, millions connected. The signal showed Leo before a wooden altarpiece carved with pre-Hispanic floral motifs. He spoke briefly about the need to listen to the cry of the earth and the poor with the same intensity. He did not mention a return date, nor explain his whereabouts. He did announce the imminent publication of a magisterial text on ecology of the heart. The image of the Pope, visibly serene and with a firm voice, silenced rumors of illness. After the Angelus, markets stabilized, and media attention turned toward the content of the future document. Even secular critics admitted the pontiff's communicative skill. With few words, he converted mystery into moral impulse. However, the enigma persists. In the Curia, there is the impression that the return will not be a simple physical return, but the beginning of a profound reconfiguration of ecclesial structure. Secretaries of dicasteries prepare reform reports that until recently seemed unthinkable: budgetary decentralization, greater role of lay people in decision-making, and external audits of funds. Hundreds of kilometers away, at the summit, where the monastery rises, the night wind blows between cypresses and cacti. The Pope walks slowly through the cloister, accompanied only by the murmur of a distant psaltery. He stops his steps before a wooden door barely illuminated by the moon and pronounces a prayer in a low voice. On the other side, awaits a commission of base theologians convened to outline the final chapters of the encyclical. He knows that when he returns to Rome, the document must be sealed. The clock marks dawn. A discreet bell announces the first liturgical hour. A silent line of barefoot monks forms. Leo joins, bowing his head with humility. No one speaks. Everyone perceives that history is brewing. The horizon begins to tinge with pink over the mountains, and for an instant, it seems that time suspends to listen to the plain chant that rises among tenuous clouds. The world still doesn't know the exact location, but the morning mist reveals the essential. The universal church is entering unknown territory, and the spiritual compass points to a path back to radical simplicity. The mystery remains, expectation grows, and the retreat days become numbered. The decisions that emerge from the silence will resonate on continents, from Rio's favelas to Berlin's cathedrals, passing through refugee camps in the Mediterranean. Only then will it be verified if these vacations are truly a threshold towards something much greater than rest. The 7th week passed with a dense rhythm of events that, although hidden behind the mountain's thickness, reverberated in all corners of the church. At dawn, Pope Leo began a 40-hour vigil before an ancient icon rescued from a Jesuit mission. The monks arranged oil lamps that crackled on contact with the cold air perfumed with resin. During that span, the pontiff barely tasted cornbread and an infusion of mountain herbs. His prayers alternated with long silences, fruit of discernment that was no longer just personal, but ecclesial and planetary. In Rome, cardinals received fragmentary reports. "The Holy Father is in full contemplation," said an encrypted message. "The magisterial text has entered final phase," added another. Those lines awakened both relief and anxiety, as the Curia understood that each hour of silence lengthened the list of pending issues appointments in various dioceses, dialogue with Beijing, negotiation table in Sudan, and supervision of hospital funds. Meanwhile, the monastery corridors became improvised diplomatic routes. Delegates from indigenous peoples arrived with embroidered mantles and ceremonial staffs. They brought amaranth seeds, aromatic woods, and small carvings representing Pachamama. The Pope received them in an open cloister, with the breeze laden with incense and pollen. A friar acted as interpreter. The leaders explained that the earth had begun to complain with droughts and unknown plagues, and that they expected from the Bishop of Rome words capable of moving heads of state. Leo listened without interrupting, and at the end gave them a manuscript, a prayer in Latin and Spanish that invoked the harmony of creation that beats in every culture. The gesture was filmed by a discreet camera from the Communications Secretariat and archived with some reserve shots. It was intuited that sooner or later, those images would see the light. On the 8th day of the vigil, 2 economists from the University of Louvain also arrived, experts in ethical finance. They climbed by mule to the monastery with sealed folders containing proposals for a global solidarity pact. They explained to the pontiff the viability of an international tax on stock transactions destined for restoration of collapsed ecosystems. Leo asked that everything would be summarized in 3 pages, plain language without technicalities. His objective, he said, was to speak to the heart of peoples and to the conscience of legislators, not only to the mind of specialists. Meanwhile, a summer storm lashed Rome with thunder that shook the domes. For the faithful waiting for news in St. Peter's Square, each lightning bolt seemed to presage the proximity of an announcement. Suddenly, the giant screens installed for Marian prayer lit up with a notice the Pope would appear in a global transmission upon completing 50 days of retreat. Excitement spread like fire. Some journalists suggested that the duration evoked Pentecost, insinuating a theological parallel silence as waiting for the Spirit before a great proclamation. In the monastery, preparations intensified. 2 lay brothers varnished a rustic lectern. Others polished a centennial foundry bell. Sister Magdalena reviewed every detail of the final speech, comparing biblical quotes in Hebrew and fragments from Latin American thinkers. The Pope Serene reviewed the text by candlelight, correcting with a fountain pen. His handwriting undulated between narrow margins like a river that overflows with measure. At the last hour, he changed a verb where it said, "we should." He wrote, "We must," convinced it was a time of urgency, not hypothetical future. The night before the global message, the sky cleared and revealed a vault of brilliant stars. Leo walked to a natural viewpoint, accompanied only by the prior. From there, a valley dotted with fireflies could be contemplated. A torrent whispered in the depths. The Pope remembered a scene from his youth, when being auxiliary bishop, he mediated in a mining conflict and listened to an old man who affirmed, "Listening to the earth is listening to God." Those words, distant in time, now became the guiding thread of his encyclical. The designated day arrived. At 12:00 GMT, millions of devices connected. The signal showed a narrow stone corridor through which the Pope advanced, leaning on a simple staff. His white cassock contrasted with the monastery's ochre. Upon reaching the lectern, a breeze lifted the pages, and the pontiff smiled as if playing with the wind. Then in measured Spanish, he began, "Brothers and sisters, I come from the silence of the mountains to speak to you of the earth's cry and the cry of the poor, which are one lament before God." He did not mention his location, nor did he refer to his health. He went straight to the core. He announced the encyclical, Fraternity of the Earth, dedicated to integral ecological conversion and life-centered economy. He enumerated concrete commitments, environmental audits for all dioceses, a database of clean energy projects, and creation of a pontifical fund for peoples displaced by climate change. He invited rulers and business people to sign a reparation pact, emphasizing that indifference is the greatest heresy of our time. The speech lasted 17 minutes. Upon concluding, he raised a corn seed and proclaimed, "Here beats the gospel of creation." That image, reproduced in real time, provoked applause and tears. In Nairobi, Maasai communities celebrated with chants. In Manila, fishermen waved nets in gesture of offering. In Warsaw, young Catholics hung banners saying, "We are custodians, not owners." Even in secular forums, academics recognized the audacity of convening a moral treaty whose metric was not GDP, but the dignity of ecosystems. After the Angelus, the Pope withdrew without indicating a return date. However, the diplomatic machinery was set in motion. Embassies approached the Secretariat of State to adhere to the pact. Ethical investment funds announced divestment from fossil fuels. Several multinationals, fearing being left out, requested audiences to present ecological transition plans. Strategic silence had become a catalyst for historic decisions. In the monastery, the community celebrated with a frugal lunch of beans and quelites. The Pope conversed with the monks, laughing with frank simplicity. In mid-afternoon, he asked permission to work on a pending task. He reviewed curious statutes and sketched a decentralization project that expanded competencies of episcopal conferences. He proposed to set a 10-year limit on high Vatican administration positions and establish parity quotas for laymen and laywomen in consultative bodies. Those assisting him intuited the scope of reform. It implied real redistribution of power. Meanwhile, in Rome, the Swiss Guard received orders to prepare the Apostolic Palace for an imminent return. The commander inspected elevators, reviewed security systems, and arranged an anti-drone protocol. Although no one knew the exact date, every detail had to be ready. 3 return routes were considered to mislead the press: via Lisbon, via Rabat, or a direct night flight to Ciampino. The surprise factor remained an indispensable shield. In the 10th week, the Pope convened members of his private council to the monastery. They arrived in small groups, without cassocks, and with light backpacks. They spent 2 days of joint retreat, subjecting curial reform to Ignatian examination. The atmosphere combined prayer, dialogue, and silence. One afternoon, while walking along an oak path, Leo asked an African cardinal, "What do you dream for the church of your grandchildren?" The cardinal responded without hesitation, "That it be poor in gold and rich in mercy." That phrase was inserted in the preamble of the new legislative document. In parallel, resistance intensified. A group of European prelates delivered a memorandum warning that decentralization could fragment doctrinal unity. A financial lobby hinted that withdrawing donations would jeopardize charitable projects. The Pope, informed of the pressure, ordered an independent audit on the origin of funds. His determination lit alarms among those who benefited from accounting opacity. A silent battle for transparency was glimpsed. Part 4. On the eve of his departure, Leo celebrated the Eucharist with the local community. In the homily, he said that the mountains had taught him to listen to roots when they seemed silent. At the end, he gave the prior his temporary silver fisherman's ring symbol of gratitude and reminder that authority is service. Then he went to the cell, knelt, and remained motionless for a long time. No one knew what prayers sprouted in that final silence. At dawn, a helicopter with Vatican registration landed on an improvised esplanade. The Pope boarded with measured movements. Sister Magdalena awaited him aboard, holding the original of the encyclical in a leather case. The aircraft rose among dust swirls and disappeared beyond the highest peak. A peasant observing the scene lifted his hat and murmured, "May he return safely." 3 hours later, without prior notice, loudspeakers in St. Peter's Square announced that the Pope would address a message upon arrival. Thousands of people ran under the midday sun. At 2:30 p.m., a gray car crossed the Santa Ana Gate and advanced toward the San Damaso courtyard. The pontiff descended, smiled at the guards, and climbed the steps with firm pace. At the palace window, he appeared dressed in white, and with a clear voice, despite fatigue, declared, "Brothers and sisters, I return from silence to invite you to the path of simplicity and reconciliation with the common home. Today begins a reform that is not mine, but the work of the Spirit in each of you." Bells rang in Rome and throughout the world. The mystery of the vacation transformed into certainty of a new chapter. The encyclical was published that same afternoon. Curial reform was announced the next day. The echo of the retreat resonated in the peripheries. Where it was born, community gardens received the first installment of the Pontifical Green Fund. Amazonian dioceses obtained autonomy to ordain indigenous permanent deacons, and an observatory in the Peruvian Amazon became a center for intercultural cosmology studies. However, the deepest legacy remained not in documents, but in the collective intuition that silence can be more eloquent than any speech. Leo understood this when undertaking his retreat, and the Church understood it when receiving him back. Under the vault of St. Peter's, pilgrims repeated a phrase that spread like spontaneous prayer: "Make us custodians of the silence that speaks." Among the walls of that small monastery, lost in the mountain, an oil lamp remains lit, reminding the world that all true reform is born first in the hidden, when the soul dares to listen without distractions. The uncertainty that surrounded Pope Leo's whereabouts not only fed conspiracy theories, but also provoked a profound internal debate in the Church. The cardinals closest to the pontiff met in private sessions, evaluating the implications of such a prolonged and enigmatic retreat. Some perceived in that pause an opportunity for the Pope to reflect on necessary reforms, while others feared that the absence would weaken pontifical authority at a critical moment. In Latin American Catholic communities, news of the retreat was received with a mixture of hope and concern. Parish priests and lay people organized vigils, outdoor masses, and candlelight processions, praying for the Holy Father's spiritual and physical health. On social networks, hashtags became trending, reflecting the effective connection that millions maintained with their spiritual leader. Meanwhile, Religious geopolitics analysts studied the possible impact of the temporary absence on Vatican international relations. The Holy See, famous for its silent but effective diplomacy, faced a visible leadership vacuum. Governments with strong Catholic tradition observed cautiously, anticipating shifts in Vatican policy on migration, environment, and human rights. In Rome, daily life proceeded with apparent normalcy, but beneath the surface, latent tension was perceived. Vatican employees worked with unusual discretion, aware that any leak could unleash a media storm. Access controls were reinforced, and Swiss Guard members received strict instructions. The Pope's privacy must be preserved at all costs. The mystery also reached the academic community. Historians, theologians, and anthropologists dusted off maps and files from the secret archive in search of routes that ancient missionaries described as paths of penance. Some suggested that Leo was following the steps of saints who isolated themselves to achieve greater mystical clarity. Others interpreted the withdrawal as a theological act in itself, destined to underscore the urgency of contemplation in a world saturated with information. Sister Magdalena, the theologian accompanying the Pope, gained involuntary prominence. Her studies on the mysticism of the Desert Fathers and her experience in eremitic retreats reinforced the theory of a contemplative retreat with academic dimension. Rumors indicated that she conducted daily colloquiums with Leo centered on the notion of sacred time and the need to rethink authority as service. A few weeks later, discreet leaks revealed the existence of an encyclical draft centered on integral ecology and social justice. The document, presumably in the Pope's hands during his retreat, contained passages destined to relaunch doctrine on creation as a non-negotiable gift and to demand global co-responsibility in the face of environmental devastation. Experts pointed to a high moral caliber text capable of shaking both markets and multilateral climate politics. During the second half of the retreat, diffuse signals arrived about the Pope's health. Medical sources from Gemelli Clinic declared off the record that no file had been requested, which indicated good physical condition. In contrast, a Filipino bishop commented to a European newspaper that Leo had traveled with a small team of cardiologists. Both versions coexisted without the Vatican issuing clarification. Meanwhile, inside the supposed retreat location, an ancient monastery nestled in mountains, only accessible by mules, routine followed a monastic rhythm. The Pope slept in an austere cell, attended the liturgy of hours with local friars, and spent long afternoons reviewing documents on indigenous solidarity economies. The prior, a man of Zapotec origin, avoided pronouncing the word vacation. He spoke of examination of the world's conscience. In private conversations, the pontiff reflected on the fragility of the common home and the temptation of power in the digital age. He pointed out that excess visibility threatened the core of the Petrine ministry based on silent service. He also meditated on passages from Isaiah about the voice crying in the wilderness and interwove them with current testimonies of Amazonian peoples whose languages risk extinction. The mystery remains. Expectation grows, and the retreat days become numbered. The decisions that emerge from this silence will resonate on continents, from Rio's favelas to Berlin's cathedrals, passing through refugee camps in the Mediterranean. Only then will it be verified if these vacations are truly a threshold towards something much greater than rest. Under the vault of St. Peter's, pilgrims repeated a phrase that spread like spontaneous prayer: "Make us custodians of the silence that speaks." Among the walls of that small monastery, lost in the mountain, an oil lamp remains lit, reminding the world that all true reform is born first in the hidden, when the soul dares to listen without distractions.